In this video, I'd like to talk about Kime, what it is, what it's for, and some of the myths surrounding it. Different martial arts use the term Kime to refer to different things, but in karate, it's often used to refer to a technique's power, focus, decisiveness. And often as not, it's used to refer to the brief locking of the muscles that happens at the end of a technique. And it's that brief locking of the muscles that I'd like to talk about in this video. So before we get into what it's for, let's talk about what it's not for, because there are some quite widespread myths around it. So the first one of those is that it adds to the power of a technique, and it does not. And it should be obvious that it does not, because it happens at the end of the technique. The technique has already transferred its power by the time Kime comes into play. So the fist hits the target, drives into the target, and just before the full extension of the limb, there's that brief tensing of the muscles. So at that point, the power has already been transferred. So that Kime, that tensing of the muscles, nothing to do with power generation. The other thing you sometimes hear is it's for absorbing the back shock that comes from the target or the enemy. And that's just really bad physics, right? So we know we've got Newton's laws of motion, and one of those is that every action has an equal and opposite reaction. So people think, we need to be ready to brace ourselves from that force, but the huge component of this that they're overlooking is your body is already generating a massive force in the opposite direction. So you've got your strike going this way, you've got the force from the object coming the other way, and what tends to happen is it just brings the limb to a stop, right? So, and we know this because if there was this big back shock coming in at you, kicks wouldn't work. We'd fall over every time we did one because we're standing on one foot and in no position to brace the back force, right? But we know that in practice, what happens is your foot swings into the bag with all the power, speed, and energy. You hit the bag. Through Newton's laws of motion, a force comes back from the bag into your foot and brings the foot to a stop, right? You don't suddenly fall over. There's not this huge back shock. I think part of that myth may come from the fact that the practice of on a makiwara, because it's rooted and wooden and bolted to the floor, so as you bend it, it wants to come back. But the makiwara is a bad analogue for human beings, and in actual conflict, you don't get this big back shock. We know we don't. So both of those myths, that tensing of the muscles that we often refer to as Kime, nothing to do with power generation, at least not directly, and nothing to do with bracing for impact. Its purpose, its true purpose, is it's an emergency brake at the extreme end of a technique, in order to prevent you hyperextending, so you don't throw yourself off balance, put yourself in a vulnerable position, and so you don't injure the joints through hyperextending. We need to generate as much force as possible, so we have a lot of mass accelerating at great speed. Now, as we do that, if the technique hits, then we have no problem, because as we hit the target, the energy from the target coming back into us will slow it down. But if it misses, or the target doesn't absorb all the force, and that force that we've generated is still going, will continue to move. We'll end up over-rotating, losing balance, falling over, popping an elbow, hyperextending your shoulder. You're going to injure yourself and throw yourself off posture. So what we do is we generate as much force as we can and continually drive it in one direction. And just at the moment where to continue to let that force run would be possibly injurious to us or would throw us off balance, we apply that very brief locking of the muscles as an emergency brake to bring everything to a brief halt. That's its purpose. And it's not unique to karate either. Boxers do it all the time. Watch a boxer when they're shadow boxing. You see this kind of little popping of the muscles that they do. At the extreme end to slow it down, bump, and then again, then they can retract it. Right? So it's not unique to karate. Boxers do it too. And we see it through all striking arts when they hit the air. Now, of course, when we do it in kata, we are consistently hitting the air, right? So there's Kime on every movement. But when you were applying those movements, a lot of that locking of the muscles wouldn't be needed because the target would absorb the force, right? But when there's no target to absorb the force, we need to get into the habit of locking that muscle right at the very end. Don't want to slow it down earlier because that would take away from the power of the technique. So we drive everything forwards, and right at the very end, that's when we apply the emergency brake. When we do it in kata, it makes the movement look sharp, right? Because you've got this strong dynamic movement suddenly coming to an abrupt halt. And I think sometimes people look at the aesthetics of that movement and go, wow, that looks really powerful. And then misunderstand that locking of the muscles has nothing to do with power generation in and of itself. It's a means of arresting the power at the extreme end of a technique to make sure that we don't hurt our shoulders, hurt our elbows, we don't over-rotate, and we don't lose our balance. That's its purpose. Nothing to do with power generation, nothing to do with absorbing back shock. It's a safety measure right at the very end to protect us and to make sure that we don't overcommit to a technique. That's what Kime is for.